Hello, my name is Mathew and in this tutorial what we're going to do is look at multipass renders to support compositing in Nuke or any other compositing package. Specifically, we're looking at producing multipass renders using the Arnold renderer in May of 2018, which is Arnold version 5, and we're going to be looking at what they refer to as AOVs, alternate output values, which is their name for multiple passes. Okay, so just to understand what we're trying to achieve, if we look at the composite that we've got here, I've got a composite here which is made up of this image and and this image, okay, which have been merged together, okay, to create this final output. Now, by having multiple passes, what we're able to do is actually separate all the different elements here, okay, and we can control each element. So, for example, here, if I click on this grading tool here, I can adjust this, and I can actually adjust the amount of shadow that I've got on my ball here, or I could click this grade node and adjust the amount of specular light that's on the ball. Okay, now what we've got here is if I look at the different outputs that we've got our diffuse output, so that's just the light that is the diffuse light that is bouncing off the ball. Okay, this is the specular light that's bouncing off the ball, and you can see that we actually have a HDRI image that is creating this, and we'll see that in the Maya scene in a moment. Okay, and this is this channel here is the diffuse light that is bouncing off the ball onto our floor. Okay, and then this is the specular light that's bouncing off the ball onto the floor, and then this channel here is not our shadow, but our shadow difference. So it's the difference between the shadow that Maya has generated. Sorry, it's the difference between the shadow that Maya has generated and what would originally be there in the comp, so that we can actually bring that light back in. So those are the different passes that we're trying to create, obviously along with a alpha pass as well, which I'll quickly show you. Let's have a look. Here we go. Yeah, here we are. So this is the along with the alpha pass as well that we're going to use with our merge. So let's get back into Maya. So the scene that we have, I'm just going to navigate around our scene and show you what we have. Hang on, I'm just going to go into the perspective view. So the scene that we have is a camera here. Hang on, I'm just going to go here. We've got a camera here which I've set up to replicate the Blackmagic camera, okay, which is the Blackmagic cinema camera which I used, and the lens combination that I used with that as well. Okay, so you can see that I've got that set up in terms of the aperture here and the focal length here. Okay, then what we've got is I've got a plane which I need in order to pick up my shadows, and I've got a ball here which I want to output as a green ball. Okay, I've also got the plate that I want to put in the background just to help me line things up, and obviously I've used this plate to line up the position of this camera so that the plane exactly fits over the top of this floor, so that the virtual plane is completely lined up to this floor. Okay, and I did that sort of manually. Okay, what I've also got is a HDRI light source, and what I've done is carefully position, and this HDRI light source was loaded in using Arnold. So again, I went Arnold, lights, Sky Dome, and then brought in this HDR image. Now the HDR image was actually shot in this location, so it was actually shot in this location, in this atrium, at the point where I'm going to put this virtual ball. So it collects all the light that's going to hit the ball in that location. Okay, okay, so when I've loaded this in, what I've done is I've been careful to actually line this up so that it's over the top of, it doesn't need to be the same size as the ball, but you want it to be positioned so that it's in the same position as the ball, so it's lined up over the ball, okay? And also I've made sure to rotate this as well, and you can just use the standard rotation, move and rotation tools to rotate this so that the actual reflections line up with the background plate. Okay, so that's everything set up. Let's have a look at what we've got at the moment. So at the moment, all I've done is I've put on the standard Maya, the AI standard surface shader with with the default settings onto both the plane and this sphere. So let's have a quick look what we've got here. So I'm just going to go into Arnold, and I'm going to use the Arnold renderer. Okay. Excellent. So you can see that what we've got here is we've got our HDRI light source, and you can see that's reflecting off the specular light here, and so the light source is working nicely, and the only thing I've got is this light source. So this shadow is being entirely generated by this light source. I'm just going to pause while it finishes rendering. Okay, so this is finished rendering now, but you can see there's quite a lot of noise still on this where the light is. So one of the things you need to do is you need to go back into the, so if I go into the perspective view, so I'm just going to come out of here and into the perspective view. If you select the sky dome, one of the things we want to do is turn up the samples. So typically I'll just turn it up to 3. You don't want to go crazy with this, and then what you'll see is it's going to start re-rendering, and hopefully we'll get a smooth result. So let's have a look what we get. Okay, so you can see already that we're getting a much smoother result from this render. This is much more pleasing for what we want. Okay, so so what I've done there is just turn up this samples attribute here on the sky dome. Okay, next thing I want to do is I want to create a green material for this ball. Okay, so I'm just going to close this, and I'm going to go back into our view here. This view is actually, this is the camera view here. I've just set up a separate camera for that, as you can see, as we spoke about earlier. And what I've also done is I've actually locked the camera so that I can't move the camera around. That's completely locked. If I want to move around my scene, I've got to go into here. So all I did was just go into control panel and just lock the rotation and translation attributes for this. Okay, not in the control panel, sorry, the channel box, and lock those translation and rotation values. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to right click on this ball, and I want to go assign new material. Okay, and I'm going to use a shader. I'm going to use the AI standard surface shader, and I'm pretty much just going to keep it the attributes pretty much as they are. I want a shiny ball. Okay, I don't want it to be particularly rough. But a little bit of roughness just to give it some natural look. One of the things I'm going to do is I just want to make it green. Okay, I just want to give it some colour, otherwise it doesn't really look particularly appealing. So I'm going to make it sort of a bright green. There we go. So I've got a green ball there. Be careful not to turn up your diffuse too much, because if your diffuse is too bright, then you've got no latitude for the specular light to come in, and that's especially the case if you're dealing with a purely white material. Okay, and then the other thing I might do is just give it a little bit of metalness. Let's have a look. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is just see what that looks like in our renderer. And I've actually got the I've got it switched on to L here. I hadn't realised that. So if I just switch on to RGB, okay. So there we are. We've got a kind of we've got a sphere. It's got a bit of metalness to it, and you can see it's kind of it's reflecting onto our surface here, okay, and creating some light here. So that bit's running as we would expect. Okay, so I'm going to turn that off. Next thing we want to do is this floor. What we want is we want this floor to receive shadows and reflections, but we don't want the floor to actually appear itself. We just want the shadows and reflections so that we can add that to our comp. So what we're going to do is I'm going to right click, I'm going to go assign new material, and I'm going to use a different shader. So I'm going to use the Arnold aiShadowMatte. So this is an Arnold shader, this is also an Arnold shader. So I'm going to use this. Okay, and one of the things I want to do is I actually want to turn off use background. Okay, the reason for that is because I want to be able to separate out the shadows, and so it won't separate out the shadows if I don't have that switched on. So I'm going to turn that off. The other thing I want to do is I want to turn on indirect and indirect specular, and what that will do is it will cause it to actually create an indirect diffuse AOV pass and an indirect specular pass, okay, which I want to have as separate passes. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to set up this floor to kind of have the same kind of attributes, this plane to have the same attributes as my floor. So the floor isn't completely shiny, okay? So actually, this intensity here of 0.1 is pretty good, actually, because in terms of specular intensity, because it's not that shiny. So let's try, I'm going to go and put it to 0.2 though, just turn it up. But it shouldn't be really shiny, because that's not how the floor works. Then in terms of diffuse light, I think I'm going to stick with the default value, okay? Let's see what we get. So I'm just going to go into render again. Okay, so now what we can do, we can see the effect of the reflections and the shadows on our floor. So you can see what impact that's having. Okay, great. So I'm really happy with our scene now and how this is set up with our materials. Now what I want to do is render out the appropriate passes in order to be able to composite this into a compositor like Nuke. Okay, so I'm just going to turn this off. So what we want to do is set up what we call our AOVs. Okay, now one of the things you want to do is if you click on the AOV tabs here, okay, you can see these are the different AOVs. So at the moment I'm still looking at the aiShadowMatte material, and what you'll see is this is a list of the AOVs that the aiShadowMatte material can produce. Now in order to enable those, I've got to go into my render settings. So I'm going to go into my render settings. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to click, so I'm going to select the, I'm going to go into AOVs, and I'm going to click on aiShadowMatte, and it's going to give me the passes that are specific to the aiShadowMatte material. Okay, so these are passes that this particular shader creates, and I'm going to add all those. Okay, so rather than being available, add them to active, and you can see as I add them, they get listed down here. Now, the eagle-eyed amongst you would have already noticed that for some reason, this indirect specular is not in this list. I don't know why that is, but we can still grab it. What I need to do is I need to copy the name, and I need to go add custom, and then what I need to do is paste that name in there and go create. Now, let's see if that's working. So if I go into my Arnold renderer again, what you'll see is if I click on this beauty, I can actually see all these passes. So I can see the indirect diffuse. So this is the light reflecting off the ball onto our ground. This is, and that's a diffuse light. This is the specular light reflecting off our ball onto the ground. Then I can click shadow, okay, and this is the shadow that we're getting, okay. Which we're not going to use because actually the shadow is already there in terms of the specular and diffuse light, so I'm probably not going to use that. Okay, in fact the shadow will be there by virtue of the alpha matte that we've got, so I'm probably not going to end up using that. This is the difference. So what I can do is I can use this to bring, where the shadow is brought in by the alpha matte, I can use this to bring in to bring in the shadow back in. Okay, and where I'm talking about the alpha matte, what I'm going to do is if I just go back to the beauty pass and then switch this to the alpha channel, you can see that the alpha matte is actually putting in the shadows for us here. Okay, so you can see that it's creating a shadow area for us there that we can use in our comp. Okay, and if I just go back to RGB, we go RGB, and this is the shadow mask. This is quite noisy, but this is actually just showing us where the shadow is, and this allows us to mask that shadow out. But again, this is kind of too noisy to use, but I think we can just use what we've already got. Okay, in terms of our difference layer. So that's the different passes that I want to output. So really what I'm interested in is the indirect diffuse, the indirect specular, okay, and the shadow difference as well, okay, which I can also actually just make into a shadow if I want to. I can kind of use that as a shadow if I want to as well. Okay, next thing I want to do then, so I could use this also as a shadow by just subtracting. So I can use this in a couple of ways of my in terms of my comp if I want to. Okay. Next thing I want to do then is I want the render passes for the actual sphere itself. So what I'm going to do is, so the render passes available for this are actually just the standard built-in ones. So if I click built-in, okay, I can get the render passes for this. So I'm just going to, all I want is the specular indirect and the diffuse indirect, if I can find it. Okay, now if I go back to my render, you'll see that I've got, it's a little bit confusing, but the specular indirect is what we have on the ball, okay, and our diffuse indirect is also what we have on our ball, and where it says indirect diffuse and indirect specular, that's actually the diffuse and specular light reflecting onto the surface. There we are. Okay, and what's quite nice about this approach is actually we've got the light that's hitting our floor separated from our light that's hitting the ball, and that's purely by virtue of the different shaders that we're using on these two objects that allows us to do that. Okay, so if we just go back to our specular indirect, what you'll see is actually I'm not getting, what I'm actually getting is the I'm not getting what I want. What I'm actually getting is the plane, that's this plane here reflected in there, and I'm not getting the actual HDRI light source that we've got in our scene. So we need to kind of modify some things here. So if I'm just going to try and reduce this down to the corner so you can kind of see what's happening as we do it. Let's see if we can do that. Okay, let's put that there. Okay, so one of the things we want to do is if I go back to, I'm just going to reduce this. If I go back to our perspective view, let's have a look. Press space, go into our perspective view. One of the things we want to do then is we want to click on here, and we want to, so what we want to do is we want to select our sky dome, and the attribute that we need is this AOV indirect. Okay, and when you click on that, that means that the AOV, this appears now in our indirect reflections. But we still have our plane in this scene here. Okay, so we can still see the plane in there, which is not what we want. So what I want to do now is I'm going to click on this plane, and I'm going to go into the Arnold settings here, and what you'll see is in the Arnold settings, so it's kind of like what we had before in render stats, but we don't want to bother with render stats. What we're interested in is the Arnold settings, and what we want is we want this to have we want to turn off, we want to make sure this is not visible in any diffuse reflection, and we don't want it to be visible in any diffuse, in any specular reflection. And you can see that that's now removed from our ball. There may be circumstances where you do want that, but in this circumstance we don't want that. Okay, so now let's have a look at what we've got here. Okay, one of the things we want to have a look at then is if we go into our beauty pass, let's have a look at our actual alpha channel that we're getting. Now the problem we've got with the alpha channel is actually the background is still there. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to turn off the use background. Okay, sorry. What we want to do is I'll start again. What's actually happening is this background here, our image plane here, is actually visible. Okay, and is considered part of our model. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to click on this background here and just tell it not to be visible. So we just want to go RGB, and we want to turn it to none. Okay, now we still have a problem. Okay, in the sense that it hasn't actually created the problem. What is also now visible in our scene is actually this sky dome here. So this is still rendering as part of the background. So what we want to do is click on this sky dome and turn off, so if we scroll down here, turn off the camera. Okay. Now we're getting the alpha matte that we need to support our scene. Okay. So, and to support our composite. Okay, so now I think we should have everything in place in order to actually render out our AOVs. Okay, let's just check what we've got here. If I just turn this back to RGB, hang on. Yeah, we've got everything we want and everything seems to be coming out. If I just go to my indirect specular, yeah, I'm happy with that. Okay, so final thing I want to do then is when I render this out, I want all of these different passes to be rendered out as different channels, but in the same image. So I don't want a separate image for each of these. Okay, now by default, Arnold's going to render out a separate image for each of these. So in order to correct that, what I need to do is I need to go into the render settings and I need to click. So what I need to do is I need to click on one of these drop downs and select, any one will do because they're all using the same driver, and go select driver. Okay, now in this attributes window, what I need to do is click merge AOVs. Okay, now if I go back into common, what I should be able to do is, yeah, I've got this all set up. And this is just going to come out as base setup EXR. That's all fine. So now what I should be able to do is simply click batch render and this will all render out. Okay, so I'm going to go render, batch render and go continue, and all of this should render out. Okay, and rather than bore you looking at my render, what I shall do is pause. Okay, so now that the render is complete, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Nuke and I'm just going to put in a read node and let's read that in and see what we've got in terms of our passes. So I'm just going to open up its base setup EXR. Let's just open that up. Okay, let's read that. So this is what it's rendered out as its beauty pass, but I can access and see all the different passes here. So I've got the indirect diffuse, indirect specular, I've got my shadow difference which I want to use, I've got my specular indirect, so I've got all the passes that I need, and then finally hopefully I've got my alpha, and this is my alpha, which is what I want as well. Okay, so this is all superb. Again, it's got watermarks on it because I've used the batch renderer, but you can see that yeah, there's just watermarks because of the license that I've got. Okay, so what I've got is yeah, and then just the final thing I wanted to say was that obviously what I have done is I've rendered this out at the same resolution as the actual background plate that we shot as well, so they will all fit together. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video there and then I'm going to do another video on how to actually put these comps together.